An elderly man believed his son was taking him to a nursing home, but when he stepped out of the car, he was stunned to the point of breathlessness. What could have left him speechless? This unexpected and emotional story will touch your heart. If you love inspiring and heartfelt stories like this, don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more meaningful narratives. Edward Carter, 72, sat quietly on an old chair in his small room in Austin, Texas. His gaze lingered on the bustling streets below through the window. His hunched shoulders and the faint trembling of his hands, resting on his knees, betrayed the passage of time that was slipping further from his grasp with every day. Edward had been a strong man his entire life, proud of his independence. But now, his steps were slower, his hands less steady, and every morning, his memories blurred like a thin layer of mist that refused to lift. Living with his son Michael and daughter-in-law Emily, Edward moved silently through the house, occasionally steadying himself against the walls. Each time he glanced at the room that once belonged to his grandson and now served as his own, his chest tightened. His hand would brush against the door frame, his eyes darting away quickly as if trying to avoid the guilt rising within him. Michael and Emily's hurried goodbyes each morning before leaving for work, along with the meals delivered by their neighbor, Mrs. Jenkins, reinforced a thought Edward could not shake. He had become a burden. He gripped the armrest of his chair tightly, his dry fingers pressing into the wood, as if trying to push away the unwelcome realization. The idea of moving to a nursing home struck Edward like a cold wind, unpleasant, but perhaps necessary. Standing in front of the mirror in his room, he stared at his reflection. His eyes squinted slightly, as though trying to discern a version of himself that had long faded. The man he once was, filled with pride, now replaced by emptiness. Memories suddenly rushed back, pulling him to San Antonio, where he and Grace, his late wife, had built a life together. He could almost hear her light-hearted laughter echoing faintly in the room. Edward sank onto the edge of the bed, his trembling hands reaching for his old wallet, pulling out the photograph of Grace he always kept close. Michael, his son, wasn't biologically his. But the moment the boy first called him Papa, Edward had wrapped his arms tightly around him, vowing to protect and love him as if he were his own flesh and blood. Images of Michael, of Grace, and of the little wooden house filled with laughter flooded his mind like a film reel, playing frame by frame with vivid clarity. Edward closed his eyes and exhaled deeply, the weight of loss heavy in the air. His body shivered slightly under the burden of emptiness, but somewhere deep within, a faint glimmer of hope still lingered, waiting for its moment to be reignited. Edward had lived a simple yet meaningful life. Each morning, he would bend over his small garden, his calloused hands lifting fresh potatoes still clinging to the soil, while Buddy, his loyal horse, stood nearby, occasionally swishing its tail as if in response. The earthy scent of damp soil mixed with freshly cut grass was an inseparable part of his daily routine. But that night, everything changed. A sudden power outage plunged the house into darkness. Edward lit a single candle, its faint light flickering on the old wooden table. His body, worn out from a long day's work, sagged onto the sofa. His eyes grew heavy, and before long, they closed under the weight of exhaustion. When he woke, his throat burned with smoke, and the acrid smell of burning wood and fabric stung his nose. He stumbled to his feet, his hands flailing in the red-tinged darkness to find his way. The crackling sound of wood filled the air as flames consumed the room around him. The frantic pounding of neighbors on the door broke through the chaos, followed by strong hands yanking him out of the inferno. Edward collapsed onto the cold ground outside, his chest heaving as he struggled to catch his breath. His trembling hands clung to the dirt as though anchoring himself to life. 24 days later, Edward awoke in a hospital bed to the devastating news. The house, once filled with the most precious memories of Grace, his late wife, and all their possessions, was now reduced to ash. He clenched the hospital blanket tightly, his eyes fixed on the ceiling, unable to utter a word. Michael brought Edward back to Austin to recover. Silent and withdrawn, Edward sat in the car, his gaze lost in the passing scenery outside the window. He knew he had left behind more than just a house in San Antonio. He had left behind a piece of his soul. Living with Michael and Emily, Edward's days became quiet and monotonous. Michael and Emily were always busy with work, leaving Edward to sit alone at the dining table, his eyes fixed on the plate of food Mrs. Jenkins, their neighbor, brought over. Each time Mrs. Jenkins pulled up a chair beside him, she would shake her head, her voice flat but unyielding. "They don't want you here, Edward," she would say, her eyes betraying a hint of pity. "It's the same everywhere. When we get old, our children just don't want to deal with us anymore." Her words cut into Edward's mind like a knife. He sat motionless for a long time afterward, his hand absent-mindedly turning a spoon between his fingers. When his birthday arrived, the room felt emptier than ever. The only company he had was a small cake left by Mrs. Jenkins. The candle's weak flame danced on the walls, casting shadows that seemed to remind him of everything he had lost. Michael and Emily managed only a quick birthday wish in the morning. Before rushing off to work, Edward sat alone, his fingers brushing the edge of the plate, his shoulders curling inward as if trying to shield himself from an invisible weight pressing down on him. That night, sleep eluded him. His steps, heavy and deliberate, carried him toward Michael's room. His hand trembled as it rested on the door, but he mustered the strength to knock firmly, as though trying to shatter the invisible barrier that had grown between father and son. "Take me to a nursing home," Edward's voice was hoarse but firm. "Sell the land in San Antonio. Use the money to take care of me. I don't want to be a burden to you and Emily anymore." Michael let out a heavy sigh, turning away. His shoulders slumped as he replied, "Not now, Papa. We'll talk about it later. I've had a long day." Edward stood motionless, his gaze darkening. His breathing grew heavier, and his hands clenched into tight fists. "If you won't do it, I'll find a nursing home myself." Michael only patted Edward's shoulder lightly before walking away. His figure disappeared down the hallway, leaving Edward rooted in place. His hands dropped limply to his sides, the palms red and marked with the indentations of his own nails. The air around him felt heavier with each passing moment, to the point where he could barely breathe. Day by day, Edward's words seemed to dissipate into thin air. Each evening, he sat on the edge of his bed, his back slightly hunched, his trembling hands holding an old photograph of Grace, carefully kept in his wallet. His fingers would gently trace her face in the picture, his lips barely moving as he whispered apologies. Each time, his shoulders slumped further, and the oppressive silence of the house seemed to press harder against the walls of his small room. Saturday morning, Michael's footsteps echoed down the hallway, breaking the heavy stillness. The door to Edward's room swung open, and Michael entered, carrying a crisp white shirt, neatly folded slacks, and a new toiletry set. Emily followed behind, holding a stack of fresh towels and clean linens. "Pack your things, Papa," Michael said, his voice steady but devoid of emotion. "We're going on a trip." Edward froze, his breath catching for a moment. His hands clenched tightly around Grace's photograph, the knuckles turning white. Michael's words echoed in his head, each syllable landing heavily, like stones dropped into a well. His body trembled slightly as his gaze fell to the photograph in his hands. Finally, he thought, they were taking him away. He nodded slowly, avoiding Michael's eyes. His hands moved methodically to pack his suitcase, each motion deliberate and precise, as if trying to stretch the moments. When he placed Grace's photograph on top, he paused, his hand brushing the corner of the frame gently. The sound of the zipper closing the suitcase felt final, like a farewell. In the car, silence enveloped them. The hum of the engine was the only sound filling the space. Edward sat in the back seat, clutching the small suitcase to his chest. His fingers gripped the handle tightly, the tension in his hands so strong it seemed to anchor him to reality. Michael drove, his eyes fixed firmly on the road ahead. Emily sat beside him, gazing out the window, a faint smile on her lips. To Edward, the smile felt misplaced, a flicker of joy in what he believed was meant to be a somber day. As the car moved farther from Austin, the scenery outside gradually changed. Towering skyscrapers and bustling crowds gave way to rolling green hills and sprawling fields. Edward gazed out of the window, each detail standing out sharply. Old wooden fences lining the road, clusters of wildflowers dotting the earth, and ancient oak trees standing tall against the blue sky. Memories rushed back like a torrent, flooding his mind. He recalled the drives with Grace along country roads, her laughter ringing out clear and bright as they dreamed of a peaceful old age together. Images of Michael as a small boy, wobbling through his first steps before falling into Edward's arms, played vividly in his head. The rich scent of freshly turned soil from the garden in San Antonio seemed to fill the air again, bringing back days spent with Buddy, tending to the crops side by side. Edward let out a deep, shaky breath. He raised a hand to his face, wiping at the dampness around his eyes. His fingers searched his pocket for a handkerchief, which he used to blot away the slow tears that had begun to fall. Through the rearview mirror, Michael caught sight of his father, his head bowed slightly, shoulders trembling. He spoke, his voice gentle but tinged with concern. "Papa, are you okay?" Edward slid the handkerchief back into his pocket, inhaling deeply before nodding slightly. "Yes, I'm just a bit tired." Emily turned around from the passenger seat, her expression soft as she offered him a warm smile. "We're almost there, Papa. You'll feel better soon," she said, her voice as light as a breeze. Edward nodded again, but his grip on the handle of his suitcase remained firm. His throat tightened, words catching before they could leave his lips. "Almost there," he repeated silently, the phrase echoing in his mind. Was it a promise of relief or the harbinger of his greatest fear? The car moved lightly along a winding road, flanked on both sides by dense trees. Sunlight filtered through the leaves, casting dancing spots of light on the paved path. Edward sat upright, his hands resting on his lap, fingers pressing tightly into the fabric of his pants. His thin fingers dug in as if to anchor him to the moment. His eyes darted back and forth, taking in patches of forest that appeared and disappeared in quick succession. No houses, no signs, just a road that seemed to stretch endlessly ahead. His chest rose and fell more rapidly, the rhythm of his breathing quickening. "Where are we going?" he asked, his voice trembling slightly, barely audible over the hum of the engine. Michael glanced at him through the rearview mirror, the corner of his mouth lifting in a faint, enigmatic smile. "You'll see soon enough." Edward fell silent, his gaze dropping from the road ahead. His thoughts began to spiral, circling around the same anxious questions. Could this road be leading to a secluded nursing home, a place where he would be left behind, out of sight and out of mind? The car finally slowed, the tires crunching over gravel. Edward felt the gentle vibration beneath his seat as the car came to a stop in an open clearing. Michael turned off the engine, exhaling softly before looking back at his father. His expression revealed nothing. "We're here, Papa," Michael said. Edward didn't move. His body felt frozen in place. Michael stepped out, opened the door, and reached for his father's arm, his touch light but steady. Edward hesitated, his legs unwilling to leave the seat. But Michael's gaze left him no choice. He placed his hand in his son's, feeling the firm support. As Michael helped him out of the car, Emily stood behind them, holding the suitcase. Edward adjusted his glasses, squinting against the glaring sunlight. He tried to make out what was before him. His heart pounded, each beat echoing louder in his chest. It wasn't the gray, lifeless facade of a nursing home. It was a house. Edward's eyes widened, his knees buckling slightly beneath him. Michael's hand quickly moved to steady his father's elbow. "Careful, Papa," Michael said softly, his voice calm and reassuring. Edward stared at the house before him. It wasn't the charred skeleton he had seen the last time. The pristine white paint gleamed under the sunlight, the porch railings were freshly built and sturdy, and the windows sparkled like polished mirrors. Every detail seemed to pull him back to a time of happiness he thought was gone forever. His feet trembled as he took small, deliberate steps. His frail hand gripped Michael's arm tightly for balance. Edward blinked repeatedly, as though trying to convince himself that what he was seeing was real. "Come inside, Papa," Michael urged, gently guiding him toward the porch. Emily followed quietly, carrying the suitcase. Edward paused as his hand brushed against the porch railing. His thin fingers ran along the smooth wooden surface, the scent of fresh pine and varnish filling the air. Step by step, he climbed the stairs, the solid feel of each plank beneath his feet affirming that this was no dream. The front door creaked open slowly. Edward stood still, his eyes scanning the interior. The polished wooden floors, the warm tones on the walls, and the familiar furnishings, all lovingly restored, invited him in. His gaze landed on the fireplace mantel. A large framed photo caught his attention. He walked toward it, his steps measured and nearly silent. It was his wedding photo with Grace. Their smiles, frozen in time, seemed to call out to him, pulling him into a part of his past he thought was lost forever. Oh! The sound escaped his throat, soft and trembling, beyond his control. Edward turned to Michael, his eyes brimming with tears. Michael gestured toward an old armchair nearby. "Sit down, Papa," he said, his voice thick with emotion. Edward reached out to touch the chair's fabric and immediately recognized it as the same pattern Grace had once chosen. "Papa," Michael began, his voice steady but filled with feeling. "We never planned to send you to a nursing home. We knew how much this house meant to you. When it burned down, we decided we had to rebuild it. But we didn't tell you, because we wanted it to be a surprise." Emily stepped forward, placing a gentle hand on Edward's shoulder. The pressure was soft yet firm, offering reassurance. Her voice was warm and steady. "We used the land you loved so much as the foundation to start again. Even the neighbors helped. Everyone wanted to contribute." Michael walked over to a cabinet, opened a drawer, and pulled out an old, slightly crumpled envelope. "Do you remember the papers you signed a few months ago, Papa?" he asked. Edward tilted his head slightly, his brows furrowing. "You said they were for selling the land," he replied, his voice tinged with confusion. Michael shook his head, a faint smile playing on his lips, like revealing a long-held secret. "No, Papa. They were construction permits. We needed your approval to start rebuilding. Every nail, every beam. It was all for you." Edward gripped the envelope tightly, his breath hitching. His chest rose and fell unevenly, his eyes beginning to glisten. Bowing his head, his trembling hands held the envelope close. I thought I'd lost everything, Grace, this house, everything." Michael gently placed a photo album in Edward's hands. The spine was slightly singed, but the album remained intact. "Not everything, Papa. Look inside." Edward ran his fingers over the rough surface of the album cover, pausing briefly as the texture grounded him. With care, he opened it, his hands shaking slightly as he turned each page. Before him were vivid snapshots of his past. He and Grace dancing at an anniversary celebration, Michael as a toddler stumbling through his first steps, and Grace crouched in the garden, her hands covered in soil, her eyes sparkling with joy. The faint smell of smoke lingered on the pages, a reminder of what had happened. But the images were vibrant, untouched by time. Edward stopped at one photo where Grace held a basket of fresh vegetables, her smile lighting up the frame. His fingers lingered on her face as his lips moved in a quiet whisper. She loved that garden. Tears streamed down his cheeks, dripping onto the photo. Just then, a sound pulled him back to the present, a soft whinny from outside. Edward froze, his body stiff. His eyes widened, and his breath caught in his throat. "Is that?" Michael smiled and nodded toward the yard. "Go see for yourself, Papa." Edward rose slowly, his movements deliberate, as if carrying the weight of a lifetime. Each step toward the porch felt heavy, yet purposeful. As he stepped outside, his heart pounded, each beat resonating down to his fingertips. There, standing near a freshly built post by the garden, was Buddy. The horse's coat gleamed under the sunlight, its mane neatly brushed. Buddy let out another soft whinny, stomping a hoof as though calling out to Edward. Edward clutched his shirt near his chest, a muffled sound escaping his lips. Then, unable to hold back, he hurried down the steps as fast as his legs could carry him. Buddy turned his head, his bright eyes meeting Edward's. Instantly, the horse recognized its old master. Edward wrapped his arms around Buddy's neck, burying his face into the horse's soft mane. His shoulders shook as he gasped for air between sobs. "You're alive. I thought I'd lost you too." Michael and Emily stood silently on the porch, watching the reunion. Emily's voice was soft, almost blending with the gentle breeze. "We found him a few weeks after the fire. He had wandered into the outskirts of town. The neighbors helped take care of him until we could bring him home." Edward stood beside Buddy, his hand stroking the horse's mane, feeling the silky strands beneath his fingers. The warmth radiating from Buddy's body seeped into his hand, mingling with the sunlight and the steady presence of the house behind him. A long, relieved breath escaped his chest, as though he'd finally set down a burden he had carried for far too long. Turning to Michael, Edward's eyes shimmered with tears, his voice hoarse but full of wonder. "You did all this for me?" Michael stepped forward, his gaze soft as he nodded. "You've done so much for me, for us. This is just a small way to show how much we love you." Edward shook his head, his throat tightening with emotion. He clasped Michael's shoulder firmly, his voice trembling but resolute. "This isn't small, Mike. This is everything." That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky with hues of orange and pink, Edward sat on the porch with Michael and Emily. Buddy grazed leisurely in the yard, and the soft chirping of crickets filled the peaceful air. Edward held the photo album tightly against his chest, a faint smile gracing his lips. For the first time in years, he felt whole. The weight of loss and loneliness that had once burdened his heart was now replaced by joy. The house he had thought was lost forever had been restored, not just with bricks and wood, but with love, effort, and the bonds of family. Michael sat beside him, his arm resting casually on the chair, his eyes gazing into the distance. Emily stood quietly by the doorway, her soft eyes watching her father-in-law with care. Edward's smile lingered, light but carrying the weight of a lifetime of memories. "You know," Edward said, his voice low, each word emerging from deep within his chest. "I used to think I was a burden, but you've shown me how wrong I was." Michael turned to him, his hand reaching out to clasp his father's. His fingers tightened around Edward's, offering silent reassurance. "You're not a burden, Papa. You're our foundation." Edward looked at his son, his gaze moving slowly from Michael to the house behind them, then finally to Buddy grazing peacefully in the yard. His shoulders relaxed, and his breaths grew lighter. For the first time in years, he allowed himself to believe it. Overcome with emotion, Edward pulled Michael into a tight hug, tears streaming freely down his face. "I'm so sorry, Mike. I doubted you. I thought you didn't care." Michael shook his head, his hand gently patting his father's back. "You've never been a burden, Papa. We just wanted to give you back the home you loved. You deserve to be happy." Later that night, Edward opened his suitcase. His hands carefully lifted each item, feeling the familiar textures of his old belongings. He placed them in their new spots, piece by piece, as if rearranging the fragments of a life he had just regained. When the sun had fully set, the golden glow of the lights from the newly rebuilt house shone softly through the windows, creating a warm and welcoming scene. Edward stood in the middle of the living room, his eyes sweeping over the space, from the polished floors to the framed photographs on the walls. Every detail, every object carried the imprint of love and dedication. Michael stood nearby, his arms relaxed at his sides, his expression filled with quiet satisfaction as he watched his father. Emily had gone into the kitchen, leaving the two men alone in the space brimming with memories. "Mike," Edward said, his voice trembling as he turned to his son. I don't know what to say. I doubted you. I thought you didn't care, that you wanted to abandon me." Michael's eyes softened. He stepped closer, placing a firm but gentle hand on his father's shoulder. "Papa, you've never been a burden. Not once. Everything we did, those late nights, the weekends spent working on this house, it was all because we love you. Because you deserve to be happy." Michael's sincerity acted as a balm to Edward's wounded spirit. Unable to hold back, Edward pulled his son into another embrace, clutching him tightly as though letting go might cause everything to vanish. "I'm so sorry," Edward murmured, his voice breaking as he leaned into Michael's shoulder. "I let fear and loneliness blind me. I should have trusted you." Michael pulled back slightly, his hand still resting on Edward's shoulder. Their eyes met, and an unspoken understanding passed between them. You've done so much. For me, Papa. You raised me, loved me, and gave me a life I never thought I could have. This is the least I could do for you. Michael gestured toward the old armchair near the fireplace. Have a seat, Papa. There's one more thing. Edward sat down, his hand brushing the armrest. The chair had been reupholstered, but retained the same comfort and familiarity as the evenings he had spent there, reading or gazing at the stars through the window. Michael handed him a small journal. Edward's hands trembled as he opened it. The pages were yellowed but intact, filled with Grace's neat handwriting. As Edward read, Grace's words seemed to leap off the pages, wrapping around him like a warm embrace. Grace had written about their life together, the love she held for him, and the dreams she once nurtured for their family. She wanted this house to always feel like a home, Michael said softly but firmly. I think you should keep this journal, Papa, so her voice can always stay with you. Edward accepted the journal, his trembling fingers brushing over the leather cover, softened by time. His eyes blurred, tears quietly spilling down his wrinkled cheeks. He blinked rapidly, trying to clear the mist clouding his vision, but his breath hitched in his chest. Thank you, Edward said, his voice hoarse and broken. This means more to me than anything. That evening, after dinner, Edward began unpacking his belongings. Michael and Emily had left, promising to return the next day with supplies to help him start his new garden. As he opened his suitcase, a strange sense of peace washed over him. Carefully, he removed old photo frames and placed them on the mantel. At the center was a photograph of Grace smiling in their garden, her radiant expression seemingly filling the room with warmth. One by one, he arranged small keepsakes. A finely carved wooden bird, a gift from Grace, a worn brass key from their previous home, and a family clock that had witnessed countless generations. Each item was placed with deliberate care, as if each held the power to restore a fragment of his soul. At the bottom of the suitcase, Edward found a small box. Opening it, he saw an envelope addressed to Michael. His hand stilled, his thumb gently tracing the edge of the paper. It was the letter he had written on a lonely night in Austin, apologizing to Michael for feeling like a burden. Edward held the letter for a long moment before sitting down in his chair, gazing at it intently. After a while, he gripped the envelope, folded it firmly, and began tearing it into pieces. No more doubts, he murmured, his voice steadier now. Michael has shown me that love doesn't count burdens, it counts blessings. Before going to bed, Edward stepped out onto the porch. The cool, fresh air carried the faint scent of earth and wildflowers. Buddy grazed nearby, lifting his head as Edward approached. Edward stroked the horse's mane, speaking to him as though they'd never been apart. We're home now, Buddy, Edward said, his voice low and warm. And it's even more beautiful than I could have imagined. The stars twinkled overhead, their light reflecting in the gleaming windows of the restored house. For the first time in years, Edward felt truly at peace. He had thought he'd lost everything, his wife, his home, and the meaning of his life. But tonight, he realized he had found something far greater, the knowledge that he was deeply and unconditionally loved. As he stepped back inside and closed the door, Edward paused, listening to the silence around him. It was no longer the empty silence of loneliness, but the quiet fullness of belonging. The weekends became a time of joy as Michael and Emily visited often. Edward tended to the garden and spent time with Buddy, rediscovering the tranquility he thought had been lost forever. While many elderly parents are forgotten or sent to nursing homes, Edward found a miracle through love and understanding. Michael may not have been Edward's biological son, but the bond between them was unbreakable, a testament to the strength of family. Do you agree with Michael's decision to rebuild his father's house instead of sending him to a nursing home? What would you do in his place? Share your thoughts in the comments. We'd love to hear your story. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to like and follow our channel to catch more moving and inspiring stories like this one.